TFG on that channel?
Yeah, so my file name I'm just picking is week 9 TFG for table Flexbox grid. So my plan of action for us today is to create a table, create a Flexbox container, and to create a grid container. And all of those are going to be relatively simply structured, but I want to use a comparison and they're going to end up looking kind of the same. If you got my email from earlier today, I had a picture of it in there, but you don't have to reference that email or anything like that. But that's kind of what we've got going on. So I made the demo page a little bit earlier, and then I'm going to kind of recreate it here so that we can see these individual parts and how maybe one technique might be easier than another technique, and just kind of get a feel for how much HTML and CSS is involved in these, what turn out to be relatively very similar looking outcomes. Okay. In leading up to that, by the way, I was doing a little bit of reading. And on the ebook that I was reading, they were separating sections with these 3 little squares. And I thought that's kind of a nice little element to kind of break up 2 parts of a web page. And so I want to do this too. It's not that tough, and it requires us to use pseudo elements, which we really haven't. I've alluded to a couple of times in class. A couple of your classmates have incorporated some pseudo elements with various levels of understanding of what they were doing. So I'm going to hit that too. That should be pretty easy as well to take care of that. So yeah, just those 3 little blocks there. All right, well, let's get to it here. I'm going to go ahead and start off with that, make my life easy. And this is going to be comparing tables, flex containers, and grid containers. And the other thing I'm going to do today is I'm going to do some inline styles, because there really isn't going to be too much complexity with this page. And I want to have one single page, which I'm going to have published, and that it contains all of these resources. It's going to have an example of a table, an example of a flex container, an example of a grid container. And we'll see how some of the CSS is consistent or different for those different kinds of elements. So there's the title of my page, and I'm going to do internal styles, which is not the same as inline styles, although we might have to do some inline styles too. And of course, I'll do my standard margin 0, padding 0, BD 0, border 0, and then BX for box sizing border box. And let's see, I've got my reference up here. I'm just going to do things that I did a little bit earlier. Body my page, background color, and we'll just do something like EED. Font family, Donna, that seems reasonable. Cool. So I'll start off with that just to make sure that my page is loading up. There's nothing on my page at the moment, so I think I'm going to go ahead and take care of that too. And let's zoom in just a shade more. And this is compare tables, flex boxes, and grids. I'll do a headline 2 for the table. Headline 2 for Flexbox. Headline 2 for grid. So although we are going to focus our attention on one of these things at a time, pretty soon we're going to actually start to be working with 2 at the same time. And I think that's going to be a better way to kind of see, hey, what works in both, what doesn't work in both, and stuff like that. And so we'll be jumping around a little bit, but we've only got these 3 key parts to deal with: a table, Flexbox, and grid. And your classmate Hunter, on Monday's class, he was kind of bringing up a couple things about that Emmet code about putting in number sequences. I practiced that a little bit this morning too. So I think I've got the technique down. It is pretty slick. So we'll do that as well. So we're going to have these sections, but before, in fact, I guess let me go ahead and do my go live. And there's my page. I can see it's got that light tan color. In fact, I'm going to Windows, put that over to the right, display that here. So I can see that that page color is working. So definitely my internal styles are doing what I want it to do. So I'm going to do really quick styling of my headlines. So I'm just going to style the headline 1s and headline 2s the same here. Font family. I'll do that Courier New. Font size, 24 points. Next align center. Font weight, normal. Now, what I've done here is I've gone and made, in fact, am I zoomed in at an appropriate level? Oh no, I'm zoomed out a little bit. Let me zoom into 100%. So, although I'm kind of happy with this, let me do a margin, 20 pixels top and bottom. I guess I'll do 20 all around, that's fine. But I styled my headline 2s and they look exactly the same as my headline 1s. So I'm going to go ahead and create an intentional conflict. My headline 2s will have a smaller font size. And I'll put the bold on them. So you can kind of see those structures there. So yes, I am using the group selector. And if I wanted to use a group selector, it'd probably be better if I put in declarations that I knew was going to be the same for both, as opposed to intentionally creating an override. So in this example, I might have a rule set for both H1 and H2, where I do the font family and the margin. And then I'd have a rule just for H1, where I do the bigger font size and the normal weight. And then for H2, the smaller font size and the bold weight. So I'm okay with this though, because these two rules are right next to each other. I'm okay with doing that little override. And it's a good reminder that what occurs last in the CSS wins. So that's why my headline 2s are 18 points in bold, because they occur second, as opposed to what's going on up here with the normal weight in the 24-point font. Great. Now I want to create those 3 little boxes. And I don't know, do I want to do them right? Yeah, I'm going to do them right below the headline, I think. So in fact, I'm going to change my margin a little bit here, and I'm going to do 40 pixels on the top, 0 on the right, 20 on the bottom, 0 on the left. It doesn't have too much of a noticeable change. And then beneath each of these, I want to put in those 3 little boxes. And those little boxes are completely decorative. They have no real value. Now, to put those little boxes in, I'm actually going to put some HTML on here. This morning when I was practicing my page, the first thing I tried was an HR, a horizontal rule. And I was kind of liking that idea because the HR tag has basically, it's a default visual element. It makes a vertical line. And if you put it on your page now, you're really not going to notice it. But if I do an HR after each of these, notice there's no closing HR tag. Of course, I'm not seeing anything happen, but that is because of my reset rule. If I didn't have a reset rule, you would actually see that the HR tag creates a horizontal rule, a horizontal divider line. Back in the olden days, in the late 90s, horizontal rules were fantastically popular because you could give a visual separator to long stretches of vertical content. And that's exactly what they do. Now, of course, it's the border 0, which is preventing those from showing up. So I can put my CSS reset rule, those horizontal rules go in, and then I could mess around with, I'll just do a little comment here, styles for my cute squares. Okay, and I could do something like HR border 2 pix solid red. And we'd see those appear, and we could style them, we could recolor them, we could make them thicker or smaller. That was my first intention this morning. However, I had a problem with those. Apparently, I couldn't get my HRs to work with pseudo elements, which is kind of important. I'm not exactly sure why it wouldn't work, but as soon as I changed my HRs to, I did little I tags, icon tag, or not icon tags, italics tags. That then worked. And of course, if I'm using an I tag, then I have to use both an opening and closing. Now, thinking there's a chance that my website might use the I tag or italics tag in a legitimate way, I did put a class on this. So, and it worked fine. I did an I with a class. And in fact, I've got my code open off to the side here that I did earlier. This is what I did earlier. And there it is right there. I class squares. Perfect. Yeah, nothing wrong with that. However, literally just before class started up, I had another thought. There's another tag which I hardly ever use. It's the strikeout tag. S. And that one is an opening and closing as well. So instead of using the I tag, I'm going to use the S tag. And the only reason I'm doing that change is because for me, the S tag or the strikeout tag is even rarer. You know, occasionally I use the I tag. It's pretty rare, but I can't remember the last time I've used the strikethrough tag or the strikeout tag, which is the S tag. I'm still going to put a class on it, though, just in case I ever did use it legitimately. So that might get you wondering, well, what does the strikeout tag do? Well, if I had some text in here, you would see that the strikeout tag literally displays text with a line going through it, strike through. So it's not likely you would ever need that unless you were doing some kind of web page where maybe you wanted to have the old price for a product and then you have the new sale price right beneath it. It might be nice to put a little strikeout on there. But even then, I'd probably use CSS for that. With CSS, you can put a strike through line over some text. And I think it might be the text decoration. You know, when we do text decoration none to get rid of the underline for anchors, I think you could do text decoration and then there's some value to put that line through there. So even in that situation, I may not actually use the S tag. But our intention is not to be able to see any text in there. We're going to be using this tag with its special class in a different way. So now that I've got that HTML set up, I'm going to head up to my styles and I'm going to make this my s.squares. I don't need a border, but here's what I am going to do. I'm going to set its width to be 16 pixels and its height to be 16 pixels. Oh, you know what? The strike through tag, the S tag, as well as the italics tag, those are inline elements. So I'm going to do a display block. It really doesn't matter that I put display block before the width and height versus after. It's just my thought process. I think it makes more sense. Before I set the width and height of something, I like to confirm that it's a block element. So that's the only reason I put them in that order. It would work fine any other order. And then so I can see it, background color, I'll just make it dark so I can see that show up. And then I can see them off to the side over here. I can see these three little dark squares, one for each of my headline twos. Remember, my HTML is pretty simple looking. I've got my headline two with some simple text, and then I've got my empty strike through tag with a class. Okay, but I want these to be centered. That's going to be easy. Since they are block elements, I can center these squares using the technique we know to center with. Margin, I'll do, I don't know, 8 pixels, top and bottom, auto left and right. I think I might be okay with that. However, I think I might change this out to 0. Top and bottom. Yeah. Okay. I think I'm okay with that for now. Now I'm going to be coming back to this rule, but I'm not done yet, because with that one tag, I want to create 2 additional squares. So basically I've got one square that's using the S tag, but now I want to create 2 additional squares. Remember, my intention is to have 3 little squares side by side. So for that, this is where I create the pseudo elements. So S dot squares colon colon before comma S dot squares colon colon after, and then my set of curly braces. I'm only putting these on separate lines right here, lines 39 and 40, just because I'm working with a narrower display today. But normally I'd put these on the same line. So this is how we create a pseudo element. And I'm going to do something similar to what you saw before, but this time I'm going to do display block, even though technically that's not essential. It's something I'm in the habit of doing. I like to confirm that these pseudo elements, remember the word pseudo means fake or artificial. So these fake elements, the S tag is a legitimate element, but these pseudo elements are fake. They're fake in that they don't actually exist on the HTML. They're going to be created dynamically with the CSS. So they're going to be display block. Content is going to be an empty set of quotes. They're not going to have any visible content. Well, it's weird to say it that way, but we are going to be able to see them because they're going to have width of 16 pixels and a height of 16 pixels. And for the short term, they're going to have a background color of red so that we can distinguish them. And you can see these 2 little red blocks, these 2 little red squares are covering up my single black square. My single black square is still there. It's just behind the red ones. So I've got my 3 squares. I've got the black one, and then I've got these 2 red ones. And the 2 red ones are one on top of the other because they're block elements, and that's what block elements do. They show up one on top of each other. I want to position the little red squares based on their parent. Their parent is the little black square. Okay, so the main S tag is the parent of these 2 red pseudo elements. Well, if I want to position something within a parent, then I put position relative on the parent and I do position absolute on the children. So I go to the parent, which is the little black square, and I put in position relative. Then I go to my pseudo elements and I put in position absolute. Now that changed something a little bit. What you saw just happen is I still have my 3 squares, but I've got the black one is covered up by the red one, and the second red one is on top of that one. All 3 squares are on top of each other. So you just have to trust me that they're all there. Now, whenever I position something absolute, I have to say, well, how far from the left or how far from the top? Well, since each of these red squares is going to be different locations, I can't put them in here. So I'm going to create new rules, S dot square colon colon before. Now I've already got a position absolute on my pseudo element red square. So the only reason I'm putting in this rule is so that I can position it to the left, negative 24 pixels. And, oh, it's dot squares. I did dot square. Still not seeing what I would expect.
You're still missing the S on squares. It's S dot requires.
There we go. That's what I was hoping to see. Now, by the way, probably if I was doing this for real life, there's no reason to call it squares. I could have called it class equals SQ or something like that. You know, you get to make up your own words as long as you feel like you know what they mean. Okay, well, there's the one on the left. And of course, the other one's still up there. So then I just have to create another rule for S dot squares colon colon after. And this will be, I can do left again, and this will be 24 pixels from the left. So I'm doing a negative 24 pixels, which actually moves it towards the left. And then I'm doing a positive 24 pixels, which moves it from the left to the right. A little bit weird to think about, but just playing around with the numbers gets it there. And then we get our nice little trio of squares. I'm pretty happy with that. And if I'm satisfied with that, fantastic. I just go back to my red coloring on those pseudo elements, hashtag 222, make them the same color as the parent. And so now I've got 3 little black squares on there. And on that email, or that picture, or that ebook I was reading, that's basically what they got going on there. Just a visual element, just letting the reader know that we're changing, not chapters necessarily, but we're changing into a new section, a new area of dialogue or something like that. Now, the other reason I like doing stuff like this is because it's a visual element. Maybe it adds visual interest to your web page, but it really doesn't require that much going on with this. If you're using pseudo elements, you can basically create 2 additional elements. You can do before and after. So in theory, we could have done pseudo elements with the H2, but then we would have only gotten 2 little elements. I was watching the news last night, or now just watching Jeopardy probably. And of course, they got a billion commercials for politicians. So I'm watching a commercial for a politician. And, they have the politician's name, and they had these 2 horizontal lines off to the side. Whenever I see that stuff, I think, oh yeah, that's something we could have done with pseudo elements. So if we had text, like a headline 2, you could create a pseudo element before and after. Imagine a rectangle that was really short, just like 2 pixels tall, but really wide, like 150 pixels wide. And then you could position one of those to the left of the headline, and then another one to the right of the headline. And you can create some pretty interesting visual elements. And of course, the nice thing about that is it wouldn't require anything special on the HTML. You would just be using your normal H2, but in your CSS, you would be using H2::: before and H2::: after to create these little visual elements. These are used a lot on web pages, even though you may not notice them, because they're generally subtle little visual effects. Okay. That takes care of that phase of our activity. Those are pseudo elements. Let's head down here. I'm going to create a table. To create this table, I'm going to do another emit code thing, okay? I practiced it this morning, a couple hours ago, and I was pretty proud of myself. It's not 100% what I want to do, and my brain couldn't process if there was an improvement to make, but maybe you'll think of something. Otherwise, this is going to get us a lot of the way there. I'm going to write one little line of emit code. I'm going to do it slowly because, of course, I didn't save that. So I'm going to go off memory here. But I used that emit cheat sheet that I referred to on Monday, and I was kind of looking at it to see how it would work. Basically, I'm going to create a table that's going to have 3 rows and 3 cells. And in each of the cells, I'm going to put a number, like 1, 2, 3. Okay. So here's how I'm going to write it on my HTML. I'm going to write table.table. That's going to give me a table tag with a class attribute. Okay. And then I'm going to do a child angle bracket, no spaces at all, by the way. I'm going to do parentheses, TR, angle bracket, TD, curly braces, $, closing curly braces, times 3, closing parentheses, times 3. I'm just looking it over. I think this might be good. Okay, I'm feeling pretty confident. So there's my syntax for what I think is going to give me a table with a class. It's going to have 3 rows. And I've already got a mistake in here, I think. Yeah, So before I press my enter key, I'm going to I need to do another set of parentheses there and there. And I've lost my emit code thing, so now it's back. All right. So I'm not sure if this one will work, but I'm going to give it a try here. I guess I should, maybe I'll copy this, paste it into chat, just in case that works. Okay, let me back 3. Okay, I'm going to press my enter key. Hey, that's cool. That's what I was hoping it would do. Now, the only bummer with this is I don't know a way for it to count out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You know, because the way that syntax works, if there's a way to do it, I didn't tinker with it and my brain was getting tired. So I figured, oh, this is pretty good. This is a good improvement. But I do want these to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But that gives me a table with a class equals table, gives me 3 rows, 3 sets of TR tags, and it gives me, for each row, 3 sets of table data tags. Cool. Let's put a pin in that one. Let's go down to where the Flexbox is going to be. This one's going to work like a charm because the structure for a Flexbox container is going to be quite simple. So for this one, type this with me. I know this one will work. Div dot flex angle bracket, child selector, you can call it, parentheses, div, curly braces, $. Ooh, actually, let's do it this way. Div dot, let's call it a flex item. So that'll be more specific. So then we can really keep track of our flex items versus our grid items. So we've got our div.flex item, curly braces, $, and then after the closing parentheses, times 9. So this is going to give us a div with class equals flex. And inside of that, there's going to be 9 other divs. Each of those is going to be class equals flex item. When I press enter, there we go. And they've got a nice little number in there. I'm going to do that again, but for the grid. Okay, so we're done with the HTML for the flex. Now I'm going to move down to where this grid is going to be. I'm going to do this very similar. Div.grid, angle bracket, parentheses, div.grid item, curly braces, $, closing curly braces, closing parentheses, times 9. So we're going to have a grid parent, class equals grid, and there's going to be 9 little grid item children inside of there. I'm going to press enter. Cool. That's exactly what we're going for. Now, initially, remember, we're comparing these 3 kinds of designs, let's say, tools. And clearly, the HTML for the grid is practically identical for the HTML of the Flexbox. Both the grid and the Flexbox HTML are quite simpler than the table layout. So even just starting off, we know that creating a table is a little bit more complicated and convoluted than creating a Flexbox container or a grid container. Now, just because I'm kind of talking about these 3 elements, we're all practicing these 3 kinds of elements, I don't want you to leave class today thinking that one of these is the best in all situations. They all have their pros and cons. And sometimes you don't know which one is best to use until you're faced with some project where it seems most appropriate to use it. So just because Flex and Grid are the newer techniques, especially for web page layouts, that doesn't mean that tables should never be used. Tables have value whenever you want to display tabular data on a page. I would never use a table for my web page layout though, because these newer methods with Flex and Grid are easier to structure web page layouts. But if I wanted to make a table of data, then maybe Flex and Grid would not be the best solution. Maybe table is the most logical solution. So all depends. So these are all different techniques and they're all good for their own intended purposes. Okay, I'm feeling pretty good about this so far. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to move up to my CSS. And I want to do some shared styles. I'll just call them shared styles. In my first plan of action, where's my code sample at? So I can get this all down. Got it. Okay, I'm going to do some styling for all three of these in the same way. Kind of one of my goals here today is to do as little CSS as possible, especially because I want us to be able to compare how much CSS is required for the table versus the Flexbox versus the grid. So the shared styles, things that they're all going to share, dot table, comma, dot flex, comma, dot grid. And these are all going to have a very similar look. So for instance, I'm going to give them a border that's 2 pixels, solid 933. And just by putting that on there, you're going to start to see things come about. Okay, well, I can start to see the red border for the table, for the Flexbox, and for the grid. All right, of course, Flexbox and grid are still in lockstep with each other. I'm also going to do this, padding 5 pixels, and a width 90%. And a margin that's 30 pixels top and bottom, auto left and right. And I'm going to do a min height of 100 pixels. Okay. So as we keep doing little things here and there, I want you to always look at each three of these, together and see how they're different, how they're the same. Of course, our table is already in a nice 3x3 grid layout. I can tell by seeing those numbers up there. But naturally, my Flexbox and my grid aren't really doing anything special. Remember, we haven't done anything to the Flexbox or the grid. Those are just regular old HTML in there, and that's the default layout for any block element. Remember, divs are block elements, so they are naturally in order like that. So far, okay, this is what we have with our elements. Where'd I go? There it is. Okay, next, I'm going to focus on styles for the table. Actually, let's see what I'm going to do here. Dot table. In my notes, I have something here. But I don't want to show it to you yet because I want you to see something else that comes up. So I'm going to leave that rule just like that. It's kind of not doing anything. And then we're going to do dot table TDs. I want to style all of the TDs, all of the cells within that table. Okay. Doesn't really do too much, but still, it's kind of what I wanted to get to. Now, I'm going to jump back up here to my shared styles. I'm going to do some more shared styles. Dot table TDs, comma, dot grid. Let's see, how did I write those before? Yeah. divs, comma, dot flex div, curly braces. So I want to style all of the cells within my tables. I want to style all the divs that are within my grid container. And I want to style all of the divs that are in my flex container. Basically, I'm styling the children in these three elements. And I'm going to style similarities again. That's why I put them in my shared styles category. It'll be easier if we can visualize these table cells and these other boxes down here. So I'm going to put in background color so I can see them. Yeah, it's too dark. 993 instead. Okay, can see that. And then min width, 80 pixels. Min height of 80 pixels. And do this one. Instead of a border, outline. 1 pixel solid, and then just something dark. Outline is pretty similar to border, but outline doesn't add to any thicknesses and stuff like that. So I think that might be, it'll give us a nice comparison among some of these. Now, putting those outlines on those table cells, I think is especially helpful because once again, we can see that the cell contents are vertically centered. Whereas for Flex kids and Grid kids, their content is vertically to the top. So what I'm going to do so that everything is kind of as reasonably close as possible, I'm going to go back to the styles for my table cell here. You know, I set their width and their height. By the way, min width and min height don't work for table cells. But I can put in something like vertical align top. And that's going to take the contents of the cells and push them up towards the top of the cell. So now they are more similar to the Flexbox children and the grid children. All right, feeling pretty good about this. Now, we are definitely not done with the table. We're going to be coming back to the table. But I want to take a little side trip over to the Flexbox for a while. And I want to get this Flexbox arranged so that it looks more like the table. I want 3x3 layout. Okay. So I'm going to create a little section in my styles here. Styles for the Flexbox. And let's see where I did those. There we go. Okay, so first, dot flex. Now remember, dot flex is my Flexbox parent. So the first thing we always do is display flex. And look what that does right away. Just by putting display flex on the parent, it takes those divs, which are normally in vertical orientation, puts them in a horizontal orientation. Yeah, pretty neat. I'm going to pause there for a moment, and I'm going to create a section for styles for the grid. Now, I know a couple of students experimented with display grid in a previous exercise, even though it wasn't my intention for you to do that. But that was just, I used poor wording on some directions. But it's pretty easy here. Dot grid is my grid parent. Display grid. Now that really didn't do anything for me. By putting display grid, I am making this a grid parent, but it doesn't know what to do necessarily. But grid has some pretty cool features though. For instance, Right after display grid, I can write grid template columns. And this is where I need a little more room, I think, to work. Do that. Grid template columns, 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. I'm just trying to position my CSS so it all kind of fits nicely in the space. We can see the unique CSS for the table cells, the flex parent, and the grid parent all in one shot. And we can see the result of how we have it so far. Now, it's probably not super clear, but I want you to start thinking of it this way. Flex boxes are a one-dimensional layout tool. It kind of makes sense. I can see them naturally appearing just in a row or just in a column. They only go one dimension. Whereas grid is a two-dimensional layout tool. It can deal with easily columns and rows, and you can manipulate each of the columns and rows independently. So grid is a truly two-dimensional layout tool, whereas Flexbox is a one-dimensional layout tool.
And is that part of the reason why if you expand your page to a wider screen, it kind of stays fixed with its own size?
That's right. Yeah, that's another interesting point too. Flexbox is really controlled or manipulated by the contents of the cells, whereas grid will actually manipulate the content. So basically with Flexbox, the content controls the flex. Whereas with grid, the grid controls the content. Now, it's a little bit misleading to look at it this way because all I've got is like single little characters in each cell. So part of this, you just have to kind of trust me with it. But so grid is a pretty nice tool when we really want to focus on a specific layout that's not impacted by the content inside of those little squares. But Flexbox could also be made to look this way. So if I want my Flexbox to look more like my table and to look more like my grid, well, we can do that, of course. So that's what I want to do next. I want to go back to the Flexbox and I want to see if we can get this Flexbox arranged in a 3x3 grid-like layout. Okay. So let me bring this back over here. Cool, I can still see things. In fact, I can see with that Flexbox, you'll notice that that ninth square is just spilling outside of its parent. It just doesn't know what to do unless we tell it. So let's tell it what to do. I'm going to go to my Flexbox. And let's see, I'm going to do, I want to wrap it. So let's see. Now already, by the way, flex direction, I could put column for my Flexbox, and that'll put those Flexbox children in a vertical orientation. That's pretty nice. Of course, we could do the same thing with grid, by the way, too. If I only had one fraction, I don't think I mentioned that word before, but the FR stands for fraction. So if I only have one column on my grid, there you go. I've got that layout just like the Flexbox is now. Now, if I add two FRs, so one fraction, I got a two column layout with grid. And if I do one fraction, I'm back to my three column layout with grid. It's pretty easy in grid to go from 1, 2, or 3 columns. Okay, back to the Flexbox though. Now for my Flexbox, I'm going to do flex direction row, which by the way is its default. But then I'm going to do flex wrap. If there's not enough room for my little Flexbox children to fit in the container, I want them to wrap to a new line. So again, Flexbox is a one-dimensional layout tool. Even though we can force it to be multiple rows, like we're creating rows and columns, it's not really the same thing. We're manipulating it by setting these widths. Now, of course, I can still, I can get it looking more like that grid if I create another rule for my Flexbox. Dot flex the div children. I need to style the div children of my Flexbox. And this is where I'm going to do flex basis, and I'll try something like 30% and see what that gets me. It's pretty good. Remember, flex basis is kind of like minimum width. It's not exactly the same, but it's not wrong to think of it that way. In fact, if I did a minimum width of 30%, that probably would have worked out fine too. Yeah, min width works with 30%. However, I don't want to use min width today. I want to use flex basis. Okay, well, that's pretty good. However, you notice with my table, the cells expanded to fill up the table. With grid, the cells expand to fill up the grid. But with Flexbox, they're not doing that. So what I'm going to do with my Flexbox is flex grow of 1. Okay, so focus your attention on the Flexbox and the grid. They have, I would call these identical layouts. Okay, I mean, if you needed 3x3 grid of squares, maybe to feature products, maybe for a navigation menu, doesn't matter. If you need a 3x3 layout of squares on your page and you don't think a table of data is appropriate, well, you have a choice. You can use Flexbox or you can use grid. Well, with Flexbox, it required me to write, let's say 5 lines of CSS. I'm just counting the declarations. And of course, with grid, I only needed 2 lines of CSS for the same look, same layout. I'm not counting, of course, the things that they shared, where I had up here somewhere. Yes, I'm not counting all the shared stuff. I'm just counting the unique things. Now, of course, you could say, hey, Ralph, that's not fair. You're forgetting that instead of putting flex direction and flex wrap, you could have done flex flow row wrap, and I'd get the exact same look. You're right. So I've reduced 5 lines to 4. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, Ralph, you're using flex basis and flex grow. Why not do flex 1 for flex grow of 1, 0 for flex shrink of 0, 30% for flex basis of 30%. And we're back to that look right there. And so now it only requires 3 unique lines of CSS compared to 2 unique lines of CSS. So the similarities between these options are really, really similar, especially flex and grid. Now, even though I did it that way, I'm going to press undo several times because I want my example to feature these. I've used the flex property a number of times. I think I've used flex flow. I want to keep these broken down. I want you to see them in their raw parts. However, I understand if you want to use the shorthand, okay? I just wanted to kind of point out again that there's really not a ton of difference. There are little differences, but not a ton of difference. Otherwise, things are looking pretty good. Now, there's another neat thing we can do, by the way. We can go back to our shared styles. So these are the styles where we control the cells in the table, the divs in the grid, and the divs in the Flexbox. Check out this declaration. Gap, 5 pixels. Scratch that. That's not where that goes. Forget what I said. That's going to go down here. It goes in the Flexbox parent, gap, 5 pixels. And then I'm going to do the same thing for my grid parent. So we've got this great declaration, gap, 5 pixels. You can do that for a flex parent, and you can do that for a grid parent. It's technically a grid parent property. Gap is for grids, But as of like last year, Gap started working for Flexbox, and all the modern browsers support that. So now we've got some space in there in between those cells. But I think you would agree, my Flexbox and my grid are perfectly aligned with each other. I couldn't tell the difference. If you were looking this on just a web page, you wouldn't be able to tell how the web developer created it. You'd have to look at the source code to investigate it further. Now, for my table, if I want to get spaces in between the cells, we can do it. It's just not as graceful. So for my tables, this is kind of weird, but I actually want you to go down to the HTML to your opening table tag. There's an attribute we can put in the table tag, cell spacing equals 5. So the cell spacing attribute in the table tag does what the gap CSS property does. Now you'll notice on my table, because I put that cell spacing and it works around all of the cells, and my table has padding, there's more space between my table border and the cells than there is between the flex border in the cells or the grid border in the cells. So basically, I'm going to get rid of the padding on just the table. So I'm going to do that back on the CSS. I got to find where I did it. Oh, here we go. Table. I can do it right here. Padding 0. So I've got a rule just for the table. Get rid of the padding. That 5 pixels of padding was created earlier in my CSS, right up here. I put a padding of 5 pixels for all 3 of those items. But now I'm contradicting myself and I'm getting rid of the padding on the table. All right. So we have a 3x3 table, a 3x3 flex box, and a 3x3 grid. We've created different elements for a page. They look the same. They can all contain content. They contain paragraphs and images and text and stuff like that. Just different ways to create kind of very similar looks and layout. Now, if I was truly doing a web page layout, I would go to either Flexbox or Grid. I can't tell you which one would be the best because it all depends on how you're using this layout, how complicated do you want to make it. We're not going to practice it here, but there are techniques you can use with Grid and make it responsive without using media queries. There's some pretty complicated properties or functions you can put into the Grid layout so that you can have it automatically go from 3 columns to 2 columns and 1 column, depending on the width. I practiced it a little bit yesterday, but it takes us out into left field. It'll be something I think it would require a little bit more time to investigate. So something good for a 295 class, or if you're curious, research it, later on your own. And of course, with Flexbox, with any of these, we could use media queries. The reason I would never go with a table for overall layout is because that table has such complicated HTML, it would be too painful to try to re-edit the HTML. Because if you need to make a table into 2 columns, that means you have to remove HTML cells from rows and maybe create new rows. And that's not easy to do. So it's not practical to have a table that reshapes itself from 4 columns to 2 columns, from 3 rows to 5 rows. It's not practical. We can make tables smaller, we can make tables bigger, but restructuring their rows and their cells is more trouble than it's worth. Hence, that's why we have Flexbox and Grid. Because if we need to, on our Flexbox, we can simply change the basis from 30% to 45%, and we're going to go to 2 columns with 1 big one down there at the bottom. Or if these were 80%, It's a one column layout. Pretty easy to do. All I need to do is mess around with the flex basis. Similar, of course, you already saw this with grid. I can just manipulate the number of fractional units for each column. I am just manipulating columns here, by the way, grid template columns. Do I want just one fraction? There it is. Or maybe I want two or three. I could even take, for the middle one, I'll do one fraction, two fractions, one fraction. So now on my grid, my second column is twice as wide as my first and third columns. You can do that with Flexbox, just not as easily. With Flexbox, I'd have to go to a specific cell. Dot flex child div nth child number 2. Flex grow of 2. No, that was boring. That's right. It's not really the same thing. I shouldn't do it that way. Instead, I have to, oh man, there is not a great way to do this, I think. You can definitely make it wider, but it just doesn't seem as good. And of course, it doesn't have the same impact. Remember, since flex, or let me exaggerate this. I'll put it like a 4 in here. That's still not even doing much. Okay, so let's try it this way. What about a min width of 200 pixels? Nothing. Yeah, see, it's just not doing the thing that I want. I think I've got this written properly. Flex div in the child number 2. Oh, it's because I have that flex grow of 1. If I had this as a 0, okay, now it's affecting that one cell. So I'm able to easily manipulate that one cell. In fact, now if I did a flex grow of 2, would that look better? Yeah, it's a little bit more noticeable. But remember, Flexbox being that one dimensional layout, I mean, it affects that one cell, but everything just wraps underneath as normally. It kind of loses its grid-looking layout. So if your goal is for a multi-row grid layout, then grid really seems to have the advantage. If your goal is for something that wraps gracefully, then maybe Flexbox is the way to go. But still, it's a little bit awkward to do that. So I'm going to kind of Control Z, and I'm going to kind of put this, I'm going to get rid of that. Don't worry, something like that might be coming back soon. And then I'm going to get rid of that one fraction. So I'm kind of back to where I was before. Okay. Kind of the last thing I want to do, we're pretty much done with this Flexbox. So Chris, what are you thinking about this Flexbox container?
Well, I actually had my hand raised, but.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I've got my chat window covering up something. Yeah, it was covering up the.
You were jumping right into it. And I was just curious, if you're running like multi-sized boxes in Flexbox, I mean, is there a way to do it with the inch child, like what you were just doing? Or
yeah,
that could be a pain.
Oh, no, you could do it. I'm worried that the layout might start to look a little sloppy, but for sure, if my goal was to control these separately, then yeah, dot flex child div nth child, and I'll do the first one here, and I'll just set a background pink. There we go. So that first one's going to be pink. Control copy, paste, 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 and then we can do numbers 3, 4, and 7.
I guess I was kind of looking at if you were to make like box number 5 a larger box, and then you have the smaller divs around it.
Right. Yeah. So that may get you that look you want. However, I'm going to show you something we can do with grid that might say, oh, you know what, I think grid might be the better way for that particular look. So yeah, we can definitely manipulate these individual cells. However, here's a scenario I want to create. I'm going to do this first with a table so you can see how that works. With the table, I want the number 4 cell, I want it to stretch and be double height. I want it to stretch and take up 2 rows. Okay. So I'm going to go to the HTML, not the CSS, but I'm going to go to the HTML for my table, and I'm going to pick on cell number 4. So I'm putting my insertion point right inside of that tag, that opening TD tag for cell number 4. And I'm going to write row span equals 2. Okay. We're not done. We're still in the middle of surgery here, but I definitely want to do this because I forgot to go over it on Monday. And I know there's a couple of quiz questions related to this. Okay, so easily by putting in the row span attribute for a cell, my cell number 4 is now spanning 2 rows. Okay, but that's kind of messed up looking. So what I need to do is I'm going to go and create a 4th row. I'm manually creating a 4th row for my table. And then I'm going to take cell number 9 and put it into the 4th row. All right, kind of neat. But now I want my 4th cell to span 3 rows. So instead of row span equals 2, I'm going to make it row span equals 3 so that my cell number 4 stretches all the way down there. And I want cell number 9 to span 2 columns. Call span equals 2. Now, of course, if I want to style, let's say the background color for these cells, we can do so, but with table cells, it's a pain in the ass because with grid and Flexbox, we can just say nth child number 4 and we can background color it. That's not so easy to do with table cells because we can't refer to the 4th child. Yeah, we can refer to the 3rd row or the 2nd row in the 1st cell, but it becomes a little bit trickier. And of course, sure, we could put a class in there and take care of it that way, and that would be a little bit easier, but we don't have to do that with our grids or our flexes. So, but just so we can see them distinctly different, I'm going to go and I'm going to put an inline style here. Background pink. So I'm going to make cell number 4 pink. And cell number 9 orange. I'm just doing that so that way at a glance we can see that those cells are definitely different. Now, by the way, when you're looking at this table over here, don't look over at my code because the answer is in the code. But if I was just to show you a picture, and by the way, I have a quiz question or 2 quiz questions like this. Can you tell me how many cells are in the 3rd row on the table? How many cells are in the 3rd row? Post it in chat. Just tell me. Okay, Amanda's got a guess. He's got a question mark, so that means it's not confident. You need to put an exclamation mark when you're really sure. Another question mark. Both of you folks are right, though. It is 2. So in your head, if you were thinking it was 3, perfectly logical to think that. But cell number 4 is in the 2nd row. Cells number 7 and 8 are the only 2 cells in the 3rd row. Now, of course, if you're looking over at my HTML, it's really obvious. You can see that my 3rd row only has 2 sets of TD tags in it. In the quiz, you're not going to have the HTML code. You're just going to have a picture of a table that's all kind of messed up looking, all kind of wonky. So that's right. Oh, wait, let's make sure I misunderstood or understood your question. So cell number 4 is in the second row. Here's the little tip too. If you can see the content, the top left corner of the cell where I have those little numbers, that gives you an indicator of where those cells are in the row structure. So there are 3 cells in the first row, 3 cells in the second row, 2 in the third, and only 1 cell in the fourth. So the kind of quiz questions I'm going to give you, I'll give you a table that looks kind of like this or a little bit different. And I'll say, how many cells are in the fourth row? And it'll be multiple choice and you pick the right answer. Well, we know that, yeah, there's only 1 cell in the fourth row because cell number 4 is up there in row 2. And the same cell can't be in 2 rows in a table. That's not like it is in a grid. Okay. Now with Flexbox, we cannot easily do what we just did with the table. It would, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it would be so much more complicated than what we can do with a grid. Okay. With a grid, it's very easy to manipulate individual cells so that they span rows and columns. Okay, so I'm kind of going to pass over the Flexbox for a moment. My goal now is to restyle this grid so that it looks more like this table. But it's going to even be easier than the table because we don't need to use any HTML. Our grid HTML and our Flex HTML has been pretty much untouched ever since we first created them. So I need to be up in the styles for my grid, styles for the grid. And let's see, I'm going to create a rule nth child, number 4. This is my 4th cell in the grid. And so that we all know which one we're talking about, background pink. There it is. Check this out. In addition to changing the background color, I can write grid column start. What do I want? I want 2. I'll explain why I want 2 in just a moment. And then, oh, you know what? I meant row start, not column. Grid row start and grid row end. I think I want 1, 2, 3, 4. I think I want 4 for now, but we may change that. Yeah, we are going to change that. Let's make it 5. Cool. That was pretty easy. Now, I know I'm not explaining it yet, but I promise you I will. I'm going to do another one for grid div nth child number 9. It's going to have a background. It's orange. Grid column start 1, 2, and then grid column end 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. So now our grid layout looks just like our table layout. And we didn't have to edit any HTML. We were able to control it all with the styles. So let's focus on my pink cell number 4. Grid row start of 2, grid row end of 5. When you're looking at a grid container, the very top line up at the top, that's 1. And then the second line from the top is number 2. That's why I did a grid row start of 2. And then there's 3 after the 5 and the 6. And then there's 4 after the 7 and 8. And then there's 5 at the bottom. So that's why it's 2 to 5. Now you can also go from the bottom up using negatives. But that makes sense, 2 to 5. Now for the orange cell, grid column start. Once again, the far left line, left border, that's 1. And then it's 2 right to the left of 9. So that's why we do a grid column start of 2. And then it's 3 right there, and then it's 4 at the far right edge. So starting from 2 to 4. Now back up on this grid, I did grid template columns earlier, 1 fraction, 1 fraction, 1 fraction. Could have done this too. Grid template rows. 1 FR for the first row, 1 FR for the second, 1 FR for the third, 3 FR for the fourth. And we can make that fourth row 3 times bigger than the previous individual rows. Pretty easy to do just using these fractional sizing units. Now, if I wanted to do something like that to my table, all right, actually not too bad, I suppose. Would be the easiest way, probably just to manipulate the height of cell number 9. So I'll do that right in the side of the HTML. So there's my orange one. I'll just do height. Let's see, I did 80 pixels, so I want like 240 pixels. There we go. So if I make the height of cell number 9 3 times taller, that stretches out the table, which stretches out those other cells. Again, I had to I didn't have to, but it was easier for me to manipulate the HTML for the table, whereas for the grid, it's easy to manipulate the CSS for the grid. And then to do something like that for the Flexbox, like I said, the ability to stretch one cell so that it takes up 2 columns, it's just, I would say it can't be done. There probably is some very fancy, tricky way to do it, but I can't even imagine what I'd have to write to do so. And then knowing that we have an alternative, which is quite easy, takes away the need to even experiment with it. Because remember, Flexbox really just wants to be 1 row. The only reason it's wrapping underneath to make what looks like a 3x3 grid is because of the size of the individual cells. So Oceana, Jessica, feeling okay about these? Cool. Good news is there's nothing in class that's really going to require you to create a grid. So I'm just kind of exposing you to this new terminology. There's a couple quiz questions on grid for sure. But, oh, and by the way, another quiz. So in a grid, each row, that's a track, or each column, that's also a track. And if you have several cells together, that would be an area. I think there's a couple terminology-based questions on the quiz, and I'd give you, there's a reference that you have, and you can just look up the terms. So 1, 2, and 3 cells, that would be a track. 3, 6, and 8, that would be a track. 2, 3, 5, and 6 together, that would be an area. And then the little divider lines are called lines. Yeah. There's a pretty neat little tool that I don't, let's see, what am I using? I'm using the Brave browser. I think the best tool is in Firefox, but I think Edge also has a nice feature. Elements. Yeah, let me do this real quick. I'm going to open this up in Firefox. Control-Shift-I. Yeah, so Firefox, when you go into the inspector mode, it actually has a grid layout tool, which is actually kind of neat. So I can use my inspector, and then I can move over this grid, and I can learn things about it. In fact, can I get the whole thing? Yeah, so it's giving me the grid layout, and I can do these overlays that are pretty neat. This is all in Firefox, by the way. So I can do this grid overlay, and look, it's giving me a thumbnail. It knows exactly what my grid layout is over here. And I can display line numbers. And now you can see what those line numbers are: 1, 2, 3, 4 for the columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for the rows. You can also do something in grid with area names. You can actually name areas, which are groups of cells. And so you could put content in certain cells. It's actually kind of neat. So that's a feature. And I think the Edge browser has a similar kind of deal as well. But yeah, it's pretty cool. So there's plenty of time, over summer and fall to experiment more with this. But modern websites are starting to more and more rely on both Flexbox and Grid. And I'm going to go and close that. But I think that's pretty good for today. Our goal was just to practice a little bit more with some tables, which I think we did, but also hopefully to see what this Flexbox is in relation to Grid. And Grid can definitely do a few things that Flexbox can't, but that doesn't mean Grid is necessarily better. That's the key thing. I want you to still know that there's value to Flexbox. There's still value to tables. It all depends on what you're creating. Okay, I am going to head over to my code real quick, and I'm going to update my index page. If I can find it. There it is. Let's maximize. Let's see. This wasn't a participate. This was just a page. So what did I call it? Week 9 TFG for table flex grid. Okay, done and done, which means if you need to, here's my browser, there it is. You can head over to our Phillips 95.dev, go to class demos. Ooh, I got a bad design. I have to fix that. Okay, so here's an issue I've got. Check this out. I was thinking ahead and I created a footer, but I got this fixed height. So I've got my class demos drop down. Whenever I bring my mouse over, I have to go over the footer, and that breaks my my drop down. That's kind of lame. So I think what I will do is, what's the name of it? It's what did I call it? New index.css. So let me show you how to fix that real quick.
I came across it yesterday, but then I just control U'd on it, and then you can get the links from there anyway.
Oh.
So I didn't mention it.
Oh, see, yeah, just think though, what if I was a business and you were a customer, and you just couldn't access that product or that category because of a design flaw, And of course, how many customers know to go into the source code and grab that stuff, right?
For sure.
So let's see, I have a rule for the footer here. Now, I think because my footer is positioned, which is kind of risky, and obviously you can see why, but let me try this. I'm going to put in need a semicolon there. I'm going to do a Z index. Now with Z index, the bigger the number, the more on top it is. So if I go to my Z index and I do something like a -10, that would kind of help ensure that it's in the background. So that may be enough to fix it. If it's not, then I'll also give a Z index to my nav menu, if I know where that is. I don't know where it is. Now, here we go. Then I might have to give a positive Z index to my nav menu. However, I think this automatically uploads. So let me just do a hard refresh. Go to my, that's already looking better. I can see that the menu stays in front of the footer now.
Nice.
Now, it's nice, but it's not ready. This is it still has problems, right? And that's because I'm on a pretty large browser right now, and my menu is pretty much all the way down there at the very bottom. I'm a little scared of what would happen if I started adding more hyperlinks. Because if the user's device is smaller, and I'm not saying I'll fix this up, but I just want you to know that I'm not always demonstrating best practices here. But if I go to my folder now, it's really tough. I can just see it down there. What if my window is a little smaller? What if I want a tablet and landscape? See, I can't even get to some of those down at the bottom because they're just off the page. So the drop-down menu is pretty nice, but a really large drop-down menu for mobile users is usually a no-go there. So that's a time when it's probably better to fix this nav menu and make everything visible or have it slide out from the side or something like that. So Yeah, probably not going to fix that, but I want you to know that that's a drawback to my design, my layout. So, but if I click on this now, you'll be able to go there and see those examples, and of course, Control U to view the source code, and you can check all that stuff out all in that one file. Okay. All right, so if you got my email earlier, it's also in announcements, but this is going to be our last web dev class. So on Monday, we have a holiday, so the school is closed and our class is canceled. But on Wednesday, we're not going to have a class either. I will have extended office hours. So basically, after you feel good about doing more stuff with tables on Canvas and in modules for next week, what you're getting into is just information about usability and web design. There's a bunch of articles in here. These are not part of your final exam, so I don't want you to feel too pressured about that. There is a quiz on this stuff, but the quiz is extra credit. So if time is of the essence, you're feeling pressured from work and other classes, then obviously you can put this on the back burner. But at the very least, I think you'll find there's a number of interesting articles in here to read through and try to get a feel for different design aspects and things like that. Yeah, I stuck it at the end of the term knowing that, yeah, this is kind of a good lighthearted topic to finish with, and it can just be kind of something you read about and absorb a little bit without actually physically practicing. So that is your week 10 stuff. And you'll notice that for week 10, there is a participation activity, there is a quiz, but those are extra credit. There is no assignment in week 10. So any questions about what you're working on this week or weekend? Okay, cool. Well, folks, thank you very much. And don't forget, I can be still connected with during office hours and stuff like that if we need to work over some things. But awesome. Excellent, Oceana. Thanks. And I know I still have some points to update in your Canvas. All of you folks are doing quite well. So hopefully you're not losing any sleep over how you're going to succeed in this class. I'm confident everybody here is certainly going to succeed. But I definitely need to get some points updated. So I've got my notes off to another Excel file. I just need to transfer those over into Canvas. So you'll see that. But I'm optimistic for you. And I started working on our final exam the other day. I didn't get too far. I started making the web page layout. But you will be able to easily create that layout using Flexbox. Or if you wanted to, you could use Grid. The layout that you'll be creating is pretty easy to work with both. So, you know, if you want to use Flexbox because you've got a little bit more seat time with it, go for it. If you think Grid is kind of neat and interesting and you wanted to experiment with it some more, you could use that too.
Are your classes, are they on 6 minutes or less, smarter, 6 minutes or less, the recordings?
Oh, not all of them. No. Yeah. So some of my recordings I put out there. Some classes I just make them kind of private. They're on YouTube, but they're unlisted. So that way you need to get the web address or you need to get the URL to get to them. Gotcha. Good question. Oceana, how long will you have access to the content in the Canvas course? Probably not long. Okay. So if you're curious about resources, one of your classmates was interested in resources that I refer to. If you're curious about that stuff, let me know. Just send me an email or something like that, and I'll make sure you know how to get access to all the resources. If you're talking about your web accounts, especially, keep using them, okay? You're going to still have your 95 dev web accounts. You'll have them through the summer, through the fall, through the winter. I usually only delete those after I know the student hasn't messed with them for a year, you know? So keep using them. It's the same username and password and stuff like that. If you're going to be doing some other stuff in the fall, maybe with me, maybe with JavaScript or with WebDev 2, we'll be using those spaces again, but we'll create different folders. So that way we have kind of a separate new location for the new stuff, and you can kind of archive and preserve your older stuff.
So I guess I'll ask you about the final exam.
Yeah.
Since we're not going to see you, how long are we going to have on that? Or is it just one of those 1 hour deals?
It'll be an untimed exam. So if you kind of recall, like some of the quizzes you've taken, right? Yeah, recent quiz where it's kind of the time doesn't matter. So it'll be available. And as soon as I get done, I don't mind making it available before finals week. But yeah, it'll be kind of an untimed final exam as long as it gets turned in. Making one page, it'll be a responsive web page. And it'll be for a farmer's market. Not that that helps you, but okay. All right, folks. Well, I'm going to turn off the recorder and I'll get this recording posted for your classmates that couldn't be here with us today. But otherwise, just get in touch with me during office hours and I'll be happy to work over some stuff with you, especially if you're struggling. You know, some of these last assignments could be kind of challenging where you're creating more complicated tables, you know, for like a calendar or a menu for a restaurant and stuff like that. So just keep me posted if you're running any roadblocks. All right. Thanks all. And see you later.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ralph. Thanks for everything you do.
Oh, absolutely. Bye.
Bye now.